Katherine thought she had the perfect life with her husband, Mark, 2 kids, a beautiful home, and a marriage built on years of trust. But when Katherine stumbled upon a series of mysterious files hidden away in their attic, everything she knew about Mark would be shattered. The man she loved had a terrifying secret, one that would unravel their entire world and lead her down a dark path she never saw coming. As the truth slowly emerged, Katherine realized that the man she thought she knew was a stranger, one with a deadly past that was now threatening her family's future. Katherine and Mark had what seemed like the ideal life, a picture-perfect existence that many envied. They lived in a spacious suburban home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood where the streets were lined with trees and children played outside in the warm sun. Their house was always immaculate, with freshly mowed lawns and tidy flower beds. Mark was a successful banker, always well-dressed in tailored suits, while Katherine was a stay-at-home mom, dedicated to raising their 2 children, Emily and Lucas, and maintaining the home. On the surface, everything about their life appeared to be flawless. Mark's career was thriving, and Katherine was always involved in the PTA meetings, baking cookies for bake sales and volunteering at local charities. They attended church every Sunday, where their family was known for its strong values and togetherness. Friends often admired their relationship, praising the way Mark would speak so highly of Katherine and how they seemed to always be in sync with one another. It was clear to everyone around them that they were deeply in love. Their weekends were filled with family outings, trips to the zoo, hiking in the nearby mountains, or lazy afternoons spent in the park. The kids loved their parents, and Mark and Katherine's relationship appeared solid, built on years of shared memories and mutual respect. They never fought, or so it seemed, at least not in front of others. Even at home, the occasional disagreement was minor and swiftly resolved. It was the kind of relationship that people looked up to, the one everyone else wanted to emulate. Yet, despite their outward perfection, there was something about Mark that Katherine couldn't quite place. He had a way of deflecting questions, especially when it came to his work. Mark was always vague about the details of his job. Katherine never thought too much of it, assuming it was just a way of maintaining a certain level of professionalism or confidentiality. After all, his work required discretion, and as a supportive wife, she never pressed him for answers. But there were moments, fleeting and subtle, when Katherine felt uneasy. On the rare occasions Mark worked late, he seemed distant, almost cold when he came home. His eyes would wander, and his conversations would be short. He wasn't the attentive, loving husband she had known before. When he was around, he was present, but there was a layer of detachment, as though something was tugging at his attention, pulling him away from her and the kids. Still, Katherine pushed these thoughts aside. She told herself it was just stress from work, or maybe he was simply exhausted from the pressures of providing for the family. Life had been busy, and the demands on both of them were high. But what really troubled her was the increasing number of evenings when Mark seemed to slip away for longer periods of time, with no clear explanation. His phone was often left face down on the kitchen counter, a small but puzzling habit. And when Katherine asked, he would always say that it was a work call or a conference that had run long. Even so, they were happy. Or so it appeared. Katherine believed in the life they had built together. She trusted Mark, perhaps too much. It was easier to ignore the occasional unease, to push aside the nagging doubts, and to focus on the life they had created, a life that, to the outside world, was picture-perfect. Little did she know, this perfect life was a facade, and behind it lay a darkness that would soon unravel everything she thought she knew. The seeds of doubt had been planted, but the truth was still far from her grasp. It started as an ordinary Saturday, one of those peaceful mornings when the kids were playing in the backyard and the house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the coffee maker in the kitchen. Katherine was sorting through the mail when she found the envelope. It was large and thick, its edges slightly frayed, and it felt heavier than a typical piece of correspondence. The front was addressed to Mark in elegant, professional handwriting, but it wasn't the usual bill or promotional offer. No, this envelope was from a law firm. Katherine's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly brushed aside the unsettling thought. Mark had never mentioned anything about legal matters, so the whole thing seemed out of place. She left the envelope on the kitchen counter, figuring she would ask him about it when he came home. But when Mark returned later that afternoon, the envelope was gone. Katherine glanced around, but there was no sign of it. She felt a wave of curiosity wash over her, followed by a knot of unease. She hadn't imagined it. It was real, wasn't it? But before she could bring it up, Mark was his usual self-charming, friendly, and seemingly unaffected by whatever was in the letter. It was as if nothing had happened. Katherine tried to push the thought out of her mind, telling herself that it was probably just some routine paperwork. Mark was a successful banker, and it wasn't unusual for legal matters to come up from time to time in his field. Still, the more she thought about it, the more unsettled she became. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was off, and now this mysterious letter only fueled her suspicions. But what was she supposed to do? Confront him directly? It didn't feel like the right time, not when everything else in their life seemed so perfect. Days went by, and the nagging feeling wouldn't leave. Katherine tried to keep things normal, going about her daily routine, but her mind kept returning to that letter. Each time Mark's phone rang, or he left for work, she found herself glancing at the clock, wondering where he was going and what he was doing. She didn't want to feel this way, didn't want to doubt her husband, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense that something wasn't right. Then, almost a week later, Katherine found herself in Mark's home office. She had been tidying up, putting books back on the shelf, when she noticed something strange. A drawer in his desk was slightly open, and inside it, there was a folder marked with a series of numbers and a date that seemed far too recent. Her heart raced as she pulled the folder out. The contents were more unnerving than anything she had expected. There were financial documents highly detailed, full of figures and names she didn't recognize. There was also a piece of paper with a list of places, along with the names of people she didn't know. The last page was the most troubling. It was a single photograph, grainy but unmistakable, of a woman standing outside what looked like a city hotel. Katherine's breath caught in her throat. She didn't recognize the woman, but the more she stared at the image, the more she felt the deep sense of dread settle over her. It wasn't just a random picture. It felt too deliberate, too personal. She knew she had to stop looking. But her hands trembled as she placed the folder back where she found it. Katherine tried to convince herself that this was just another case of Mark's secretive nature with work, that it had nothing to do with anything sinister. But a seed had been planted in her mind, and every moment since then, she couldn't help but feel that something was terribly wrong. Mark had always been the perfect husband, the loving father, but now doubt crept into her thoughts. What was he hiding? And why did it feel like her entire world was starting to crumble under the weight of a single unanswered question? The weeks that followed only deepened Katherine's sense of unease. She tried to go on with her daily life, playing the part of the perfect wife and mother, but the nagging feeling in her chest never went away. She watched Mark closely now, observing his every move with a newfound wariness. There was something different about him, subtle but undeniable. His late nights had become more frequent, and he would often vanish into his office, his phone ringing off the hook. Whenever she tried to ask about his day, he would offer vague answers, deflecting her questions with casual indifference. Just work stuff, he would say, and Katherine would force herself to let it go. But deep down, she knew there was more to it than that. One evening, as she cleaned out the attic, something happened that would change everything. The attic had always been a storage space for old boxes, forgotten toys, and seasonal decorations. Katherine had been meaning to go through the clutter for months, but it was one of those tasks she always put off. That night she decided to finally tackle it, hoping it would take her mind off her growing suspicions. As she sifted through the old boxes, she came across a stack of forgotten furniture and a large, dusty cabinet she had never noticed before. It was tucked away in a corner, hidden behind stacks of old blankets and forgotten Christmas decorations. The cabinet looked out of place, as if someone had intentionally moved it there. Her heart raced as she walked closer. Her curiosity piqued. She knelt down and ran her fingers over the old wood. It was locked, but the key was nowhere to be found. Katherine's hand hesitated for a moment, unsure whether she should open it. It felt wrong, but something inside her urged her to look. With a burst of determination, she found a way to force the lock open, using a small screwdriver from the toolbox she had nearby. Her hands shook as she pulled open the creaky door, revealing its contents. Inside, there was a filing cabinet, worn and yellowed with age. But what caught Katherine's attention wasn't the dusty file drawers, it was the contents of the top drawer, where a thick stack of papers lay. She pulled them out cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The documents were filled with names, dates, and locations, none of which meant anything to her. At first, it all seemed like a jumble of irrelevant information. But as she flipped through the pages, something caught her eye. There were photographs, grainy, black and white images of different women. Their faces were blurred, their eyes hollow and distant, as if they were unaware of the camera capturing their every move. Each photo was paired with a name, a date, and a detailed description. And on the back of each photograph, a single word was written in bold letters: Project. Katherine's stomach twisted as she continued flipping through the papers. The photos weren't random. They were carefully catalogued, as though Mark had been keeping track of these women for a reason. Her hands trembled as she scanned the files, her mind racing with questions. What was this? Who were these women? And why were they so important to Mark? As she dug deeper, she found more disturbing details: locations, addresses, even descriptions of where each woman was last seen. It was like some twisted game, one that Katherine couldn't begin to comprehend. A sense of dread washed over her as she realized that Mark had been living a life she had never known, a life filled with dark secrets and hidden motives. The man she thought she knew, the loving husband and father, was someone else entirely. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she had uncovered, but the answers were as elusive as they were terrifying. She carefully closed the drawer and locked the cabinet again, the weight of the documents heavy in her hands. Her thoughts were jumbled, her heart racing as she stumbled out of the attic. The house felt eerily quiet, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Katherine knew that her life, the life she thought she understood, was about to change forever. She couldn't ignore what she had found. There was something deeply wrong with Mark, and she had to figure out what it was before it was too late. Katherine's discovery in the attic weighed heavily on her mind. For days she couldn't shake the image of the photographs, the women whose names and faces had been carefully catalogued in Mark's files. She felt a sense of unease she couldn't explain, as if her entire reality had shifted. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with everything, was not the person she had thought him to be. She tried to rationalize what she had found. Maybe it was some kind of mistake. Perhaps the files were old, irrelevant, and had nothing to do with Mark anymore. But deep down, she knew better. Her instincts screamed that something darker was at play. Katherine decided she needed to confront Mark. The silence that had existed between them in recent weeks had grown unbearable. But she also knew that confronting him meant risking everything: the life they had built, the stability of their family, and the sense of security she had always taken for granted. But what choice did she have? The unease gnawed at her, and she couldn't bear to live in ignorance any longer. The opportunity came one evening when Mark came home later than usual. He seemed distant as he walked through the door, barely acknowledging Katherine as she stood by the kitchen counter. He dropped his briefcase and went straight to the living room without so much as a word. Katherine watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. She waited for the right moment, her breath shallow as she gathered the courage to speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she walked into the living room, her hands shaking. Mark was sitting on the couch, his eyes fixed on the television, but he didn't seem to be paying attention. Katherine stood in front of him, holding the file she had taken from the attic, the papers still fresh in her mind. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to know what's going on. What is this?" She placed the folder on the coffee table, the weight of the evidence clear in her actions. Mark's eyes flickered to the file for only a moment before quickly diverting his gaze. His face tightened, and for the first time Katherine saw something unfamiliar in his eyes, a flicker of fear, something darker than she had ever seen before. It was as if the man she had known all these years was slipping away before her eyes. "Where did you find this?" Mark asked, his voice sharp, though he quickly regained his composure. His tone was cold, calculated, as though he was trying to regain control of the situation. Katherine could feel her pulse quicken, the words she had been rehearsing in her head suddenly slipping away. "I found it in the attic," she replied, struggling to steady her voice. "In a locked cabinet. What are these files? Who are these women?" Mark didn't respond at first. He simply stared at the folder, his face a mask of unreadable emotions. Katherine could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. She had seen this side of him before, but never like this, never with such raw, unguarded fear in his eyes. Finally, Mark stood up, his movements stiff and deliberate. "You shouldn't have looked," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. He reached for the folder, but Katherine pulled it away, holding it tightly against her chest. She wasn't going to back down now. "Mark, what is going on?" she demanded. "Who are these women? What is all this about?" His face hardened, and for the first time Katherine saw something that took her completely off guard, an almost imperceptible flash of anger. He looked at her, his expression a mix of frustration and something darker, something that chilled her to the bone. "You don't understand," Mark said, his voice low and menacing. "You shouldn't have gotten involved in this. It's bigger than you think." Katherine's heart raced as the truth began to take shape. This wasn't just about a few misplaced files. This was about something far more dangerous. She could see it now, the coldness in Mark's eyes, the way he was trying to control the situation, to keep her from digging any deeper. But it was too late. She had already uncovered the darkness lurking beneath the surface of their life. As she stood there, staring at her husband, the man she had once trusted more than anyone, she realized that the life they had built together was nothing more than a facade. There was no going back from this moment. The man she had married had a secret so dark that it had taken everything she had known and twisted it into something unrecognizable. The truth was out, and Katherine had no idea where it would lead. But one thing was certain: the life she thought she understood was a lie. Katherine's hands shook as she stood there, staring at Mark, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The confession that was hanging in the air, unspoken but undeniable, was far more than she could process in that moment. She had always trusted Mark, believed in him with all her heart. And now, standing before him, she realized how little she truly knew about the man she had married. The silence in the room was deafening. Mark stood rigid, his eyes avoiding hers, as though he couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. Katherine's pulse thudded in her ears. She wanted answers, needed them. But she also knew that the truth, whatever it was, would shatter the foundation of everything she had built her life upon. He wasn't the man she thought he was. But what had he really been doing? What was the extent of his lies? She took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper. "What does all of this mean, Mark? What are you involved in?" For a moment it seemed like he might remain silent, but then his shoulders slumped, and he exhaled slowly. "I never wanted you to know this," he said, his voice quieter than before, laced with an almost imperceptible sorrow. "I was trying to protect you, trying to keep you and the kids away from all of this." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. She could barely breathe, and yet she urged herself to stay calm, to not back down now that she was so close to the truth. "Protect me from what? From what you've been doing?" Mark looked away, his hands trembling at his sides. "It's not what you think," he began, his words slow and measured, as though he were carefully choosing them, as though he was trying to manipulate the truth. "I didn't hurt anyone. Not directly. I was part of something. I got involved with the wrong people, people I couldn't get away from." Catherine's mind spun. The pieces of the puzzle that had once been scattered now seemed to fall into place, but the image they created was beyond anything she could have imagined. Mark wasn't just a man with a secret life. He had been involved in something far darker, something that reached into the lives of others in ways she couldn't fathom. He continued, his words now coming in a rush. "I got mixed up with a group. They have connections. Dangerous people. I didn't think it would go this far. At first it was just money. Then it escalated. I became part of something bigger, something that I thought I could control, but it spiraled out of my hands." Katherine felt the room closing in on her, the air thick with dread. She wanted to understand, wanted to hear him explain himself, but her mind could barely keep up with the gravity of his confession. She could only stare at him, searching for any sign of the man she had married, any trace of the man who had once promised to love and protect her. But there was nothing there now but fear and regret. As Mark's story unfolded, Katherine learned the terrifying truth. The women in the photographs, the files she had discovered, they were all part of an underground operation, one that trafficked in information, money, and something far darker. Mark had been complicit, a cog in a machine he had never fully understood, but now it had ensnared him, pulling him deeper into a web of deceit and danger. Her stomach churned as she pieced together the final revelation. The law firm's letter, the one she had found weeks ago, it had been a warning. They had been monitoring him, preparing to expose him for his role in the operation. Catherine's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. It was worse than she could have ever imagined. The man she had married had been living a lie, and now that lie had caught up with him and with her. Before she could say another word, the phone rang. Mark's face turned ashen, and he rushed to grab it, his hands trembling. Katherine knew immediately something was terribly wrong. As Mark picked up the phone, his expression shifted from fear to resignation. "It's too late," he muttered under his breath, hanging up abruptly. The finality of the moment hit Katherine like a punch to the gut. It was over. The police had found a body. A woman whose disappearance had been tied to the very operation Mark had been part of. The evidence was irrefutable, and the law had caught up with him. He wasn't going to get away this time. Mark's empire of lies was crumbling before her eyes, and Katherine realized with terrifying clarity that everything she thought she knew had been a carefully constructed illusion. As the doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the authorities, Mark turned to Katherine, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite read: guilt, fear, or perhaps something darker still. The man she had spent years with, the man she had loved, was a stranger now, one who was about to face the consequences of his actions. Katherine took a step back, her heart breaking as the reality of it all hit her. The perfect life she had once known was gone, replaced by a horrifying truth that she could never erase from her mind.